I need you to do something before we go any further. Take out your phone. Open Google Maps. Find the nearest mountain to where you are right now. Look at the top. Flat. Look at the sides. Vertical. Columnar. Parallel lines running from base to summit. Look at the base. Circular. Wide. Tapering slightly as it rises. Now find any photograph of a tree stump. Look at the top. Flat. Look at the sides. Vertical. Columnar. Parallel lines running from base to summit. Look at the base. Circular. Wide. Tapering slightly as it rises. You just compared a mountain to a tree stump, and you cannot tell me they are different things. I know what you're thinking. Scale. Mountains are thousands of meters tall. The biggest trees alive today barely reach 115 meters. The gap feels too large for the comparison to mean anything. But here is the question that should stop you cold. What if the trees we see today are not representative of what trees can be? What if the redwoods and the sequoias are not the standard, but the survivors? The stunted remnants of a biological lineage that once operated at a completely different scale? Because here's what the evidence actually shows. Not theory, not speculation, but documented, measurable evidence sitting in geological formations on every continent on Earth. Something grew here before us, at a scale we have no living reference point for. And when it ended, it left behind exactly what you'd expect. Stumps. Thousands of them. On every continent, in every climate zone. And we've been calling them mountains for 200 years, without once asking why they look exactly like stumps. Part 1. The geometry. Let's be precise. Let's talk about what the structures actually look like when you measure them. Take Devil's Tower in Wyoming, 386 meters tall, base diameter approximately 300 meters. Mainstream geology classifies it as a volcanic rock plug, cooled underground, exposed by erosion over millions of years. That explanation requires columnar jointing, the process by which cooling lava contracts and cracks into polygonal columns. Columnar jointing is real. You can see it at the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. But here's what those textbook examples actually look like when measured. The Giant's Causeway columns range from 15 to 40 centimeters wide. They vary, they tilt, they merge and separate. Inconsistent heights. This is what cooling lava actually does, approximate hexagonal patterns with significant variation. Physics doesn't build to a blueprint. Now measure Devil's Tower, column diameter 1.2 to 2.7 meters. Far more consistent, running in nearly perfect vertical lines without meaningful deviation from base to summit. That consistency is not characteristic of cooling lava. It is characteristic of vascular plant tissue. Woody plant cells organize in precise, repeating geometric patterns, consistent diameter, consistent wall thickness, consistent spacing. Because a living organism builds to a biological blueprint, the result is the kind of geometric precision that physics alone does not produce. Devil's Tower's columns match plant cell geometry. Not approximately, measurably. And the formation tapers from base to summit in a ratio that matches tree trunk taper, not mountain taper, which glacial erosion produces irregularly, but the specific, biologically determined taper that a growing trunk produces as it allocates less structural material to its upper sections. A volcanic plug doesn't taper that way. A tree trunk does. Part 2. The global pattern. The same geometry exists on every continent, in formations with no geological connection to each other, no shared tectonic history, no common volcanic origin. Venezuela. The Tepuis, Roraima, Auyan Tepui, rise from the Amazon basin as isolated flat-topped towers with sheer vertical walls. Their official classification is ancient Precambrian sandstone. But Precambrian sandstone is deposited horizontally by water. The tepuis are vertical pillars standing alone, separated from each other by valleys, with no shared geological foundation connecting them underground. They stand exactly as stumps stand, each one separate, each one the remnant of something that grew independently. The Pemon people who have lived in the shadow of the tepuis for thousands of years don't call them mountains. They call them tepui, house of the gods, not rock formation, structure, something grown or placed. Australia. Uluru rises 348 meters above the surrounding plain and extends 2.5 kilometers into the earth below. Its rock layers run vertically, not horizontal as water or wind deposition produces, but vertically, as material that grew upward would produce. Its composition is different from the surrounding geology. China. The Zhangjiajie pillars, the formations that inspired Avatar's floating mountains, are officially Devonian quartz sandstone, shaped by water erosion over 300 million years. They rise as vertical columns from a flat valley floor, consistent in height, flat tops, biological taper. Water erosion over 300 million years produces gradual slopes, not vertical columns with flat tops. Siberia. The Lena pillars, Cambrian limestone, officially 540 million years old, stand in uniform rows along a riverbank. Consistent height, flat tops, vertical sides. No geological explanation for why limestone would organize itself into uniform vertical columns standing in rows. One structure could be geology. Two structures on different continents could be coincidence. The same structure on every continent, in every climate zone, with the same biological geometry and the same absence of a satisfying geological explanation. That is a pattern, and patterns have causes. Part 3. The math. If these formations are stumps, then how tall were the living trees? This is calculable. In living trees, the relationship between stump base diameter and total tree height falls within measurable ranges. Coastal redwoods have base diameters representing between 0.5 and 1.5% of their total height. Hardwoods run between 1 and 3%. Apply those ratios to Devil's Tower, base diameter 300 meters. At 1%, the living tree stood 30,000 meters, 30 kilometers, nearly 4 times the height of Everest. At 3%, still 10,000 meters, 10 kilometers, higher than any mountain on Earth. I understand those numbers feel impossible. Nothing in your experience gives you a framework for a living organism 30 kilometers tall. But consider this. Every measurement of biological possibility you carry in your mind was calibrated in a world that came after, a world that grew up in the ruins of what preceded it. The trees alive today, if this evidence is correct, are not the standard. They are what survived. We are measuring the ruins and being surprised by the numbers. That is not evidence the numbers are wrong. That is evidence of how much was lost. Part 4. What the ancient world remembered. Before modern science existed, before geology and radiometric dating, virtually every human culture on Earth maintained a tradition about enormous trees. Not metaphorical, not symbolic. Literal, physical, enormous trees described as having once existed in the world before the current era. Norse cosmology, Yggdrasil, a physical structure of incomprehensible scale. Roots reaching into 3 separate worlds below the surface. Trunk rising through the observable world. Upper branches extending above the clouds. The Norse understood Yggdrasil not as metaphor, but as the literal structural framework of the physical universe. Hindu cosmology, Mount Meru. Described with a flat top, perfectly circular base, and trunk-like structure connecting the Earth's surface to the heavens. Note, a mountain with a flat top, circular base, and trunk-like structure. Ancient Hindu scholars describing what we now call a mesa formation using the vocabulary available to them. Mesopotamia. The hulupu tree in the oldest Sumerian texts. An enormous tree that grew to reach the sky before it was cut down. Its cutting is presented not as legend, but as history, something that happened at a specific time and whose consequences shaped the world the Sumerians lived in. Mesoamerica. The Mayan yaksha, the Saber world tree. A physical structure that once connected the underworld, the Earth's surface, and the heavens. In Mayan cosmological understanding, a real structural feature of the world that preceded the current era. Aboriginal Australia, the Dreamtime landscape was characterized by enormous living structures. The current landscape is described as what remains after the Dreamtime ended. Every culture, every continent, every era before the modern period, all remembering the same thing, in different languages, through different frameworks, with different names, but the same thing, enormous living structures that once reached the sky, whose ending marked the transition from a previous world to the current one, whose remains still shape the landscape. When unconnected cultures on every continent independently preserve the same specific memory across thousands of years, when that memory describes physical structures we can still observe in the geological record, that convergence requires an explanation. Coincidence is not that explanation. If something grew here at this scale, what ended it? The answer is already in mainstream science. Published, peer-reviewed. It's just never been connected to this question. 900 years ago, something struck this planet. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, supported by physical evidence from more than 50 sites across 4 continents, proposes that a fragmented comet or asteroid struck multiple points across the northern hemisphere nearly simultaneously. At the sediment layer corresponding to this moment, researchers found nanodiamonds, which form only under pressures beyond any known geological process. Platinum group metals characteristic of extraterrestrial material. Shocked quartz requiring impact forces beyond any volcanic event. Magnetic spherules formed when material is instantaneously vaporized. And at this same boundary layer, across 4 continents, researchers found something else. Charcoal. Quantities representing fires of continental scale, a continuous carbon signature across thousands of miles of sedimentary record. These impacts triggered firestorms. The firestorms triggered an impact winter, decades of reduced sunlight. The impact winter drove dozens of megafauna species to extinction at exactly this boundary. Mammoths, gone. Mastodons, gone. Saber-toothed cats, gone. Giant ground sloths, gone. Entire categories of enormous life, erased within what appears, geologically, to be an essentially instantaneous moment. Now extend that logic. If continent-wide firestorms swept the Earth 12,900 years ago, and the charcoal confirms they did, what would those firestorms do to biological structures reaching into the stratosphere? They would burn. The debris would bury the bases. The heat and pressure would begin the mineralization process, the slow chemical exchange that transforms wood into stone over thousands of years. And 12,900 years later, when a species that survived the catastrophe finally developed the tools to look at the landscape around them, they would find stumps, mineralized, indistinguishable to their newly developed geological frameworks from volcanic rock. They would give them names, and the names would not include the word tree. Closing. Go back to Google Maps. Find that mountain again. You know what you're looking at now. The geometry. The same flat top, the same columnar sides, the same biological taper that no geological process produces with this consistency across this many formations on this many continents. The cultural memory. Norse, Sumerian, Mayan, Aboriginal, all remembering the same enormous living things in the world before this one. The Younger Dryas boundary, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, continent-wide charcoal at the exact moment the megafauna disappeared and the world as we know it began. The math. Stump diameter ratios producing numbers that feel impossible until you remember that every sense of biological possibility you have was calibrated in the ruins of what came before. Now ask yourself one question. Not, is this definitely true? Just this. Is the explanation we've been given, slow geological processes, volcanic intrusions, millions of years of erosion, is that explanation actually supported by the evidence? Or was it built before anyone asked whether the geometry was biological? Before anyone connected the younger Dryas charcoal layer to the sudden replacement of enormous biological structures with mineralized rock? Before anyone compared the cultural memory of every civilization on Earth to the physical structures still sitting in the landscape those civilizations described? The mountains are still there. The geometry is still there. The charcoal layer is still there. And the question the evidence keeps asking, the one the official framework keeps not answering, that question is still there too. Look at the mountain on your screen and decide what you're looking at.